Frost had already claimed the windowpanes of Harrow Creek when Vivian Dalt stopped screaming. Not because the pain had ended, because after 4 years she had simply run out of sound. The town of Harrow Creek, Wyoming, sat in the throat of a narrow canyon at the foot of the Wind River Range, a place that existed almost entirely because of one man's ambition. Silas Dalt had built the town's only grain mill, owned the livery, held the notes on 11 of the 14 homesteads in the valley, and chaired the local land committee, which was really just a polite way of saying he decided who stayed and who was run off their property in the dead of winter. He was 51 years old, barrel-chested, with iron gray hair, and the commanding, well-cultivated manner of a man who had never once in his life been told no by anyone who mattered. Vivian had been 22 when her uncle pressed her hand into Silas Dalt's at the base of the church steps. Her uncle was a struggling wheat farmer from Cheyenne, 3 seasons deep in debt to Dalt's land office, and the transaction was concluded with the quiet efficiency of a man settling a ledger. There was no courtship. There was a Sunday dress, a bouquet of dried larkspur because the season was wrong for anything fresh, and Reverend Pugh reading words over them in a voice as dry as the canyon. Silas had been cordial on the ride back to his property. Pleasant, even. He had pointed out the mill, the new fence line he'd had put in along the north pasture, the herd of 16 Herefords grazing in the late afternoon gold. He spoke as a man giving a tour of his holdings, not as a husband speaking to his wife. Vivian had folded her hands in her lap and watched the cattle and told herself that cordiality was enough. That cordiality was more than most women got. The first time Silas struck her, it was over a cup of coffee. She had brought it to him at the wrong temperature, too cool, because she had not yet learned the precise timing required by his mornings. He backhanded her across the kitchen without rising from his chair, a movement so casual and practiced that it took a moment for the pain to register. When she touched her lip and felt blood, she looked at him. He was already reading the land survey on the table. "Hotter next time," he said. She learned to make the coffee hotter. Over the years that followed, Vivian learned a great many things. She learned that Silas hit her stomach and her ribs during the weeks she was expected to attend the Ladies' Aid meetings at the church, because bruises could not be worn in public. She learned that Tuesday evenings were dangerous, because that was when he reviewed his accounts, and if the numbers disappointed him, she paid the difference in kind. She learned to recognize the set of his jaw when he came through the door, the particular sound of his boot heel on the porch step, the way he set his hat on the hook when the day had gone against him. She also learned, in the grinding slow way of a person who has lost all other occupation, that the town of Harrow Creek was complicit in her disappearance. Martha Vole, who ran the dry goods store and had known Vivian's mother, would sometimes look at the yellowish shadow beneath Vivian's eye and then look immediately at the bolts of calico behind her head, asking after the weather, asking after the winter rye, asking after anything other than the thing directly in front of her. Deputy Conrad Ames, the only law in Harrow Creek since Sheriff Prentice had retired to Lander, had twice been summoned by neighbors to the Dalt property after screaming carried through a still autumn night. Both times he had spoken to Silas at the door. Both times he had left without coming inside. Silas held the note on the Ames family homestead and had extended that note twice without raising the interest. In the 4th year of her marriage, Vivian stopped expecting rescue the way a person stops expecting a particular season to come. Some springs simply did not arrive. That was the nature of high-altitude country. You learned to live inside the cold, or you did not live at all. The night everything broke open was in early December of 1881. A hard winter had come down from the northern ranges weeks ahead of its time, and the Wind River Pass had been sealed by 8-foot drifts since the 3rd week of November. Silas had ridden to Lander for a 3-day land negotiation with a Denver buyer and had returned in a black fury. The Denver man had backed out. The deal, which would have put $14,000 into Silas's hands, was dead in the frozen ground. Vivian heard the horse before she heard the door. She was in the kitchen, putting up the last of the dried venison, when the particular sound of Silas's Morgan reached her, that rolling, deliberate canter, and her hands stilled over the work table. She wiped them on her apron. She stood very straight. She had learned, in the manner of a person who has survived prolonged danger, to make herself very still, very small, very unobtrusive, hoping in some animal way that stillness would make her invisible. It did not. Silas came through the door like weather, filling the room with cold air and controlled fury. He didn't speak. He didn't look at her directly. He hung his coat on the hook with exaggerated deliberateness, which was in some ways worse than if he had thrown it, because it meant the anger had curdled into something cold and methodical. He crossed to the kitchen table and sat down. He looked at the venison on the work table. "What is that?" he said. "Putting up the rest of the—" "What is that smell I was drying there?" He swept the entire contents of the work table onto the floor with one arm. The dried strips of meat, the earthen crocks, the tin cup she had been drinking from, all of it hit the floorboards with a sound like a small collapse. Vivienne did not move. She had learned not to move in the first seconds. Moving triggered something in him. "This house," Silas said, with the terrible quiet that was always more dangerous than shouting, "looks like something a squatter lives in. I bring buyers through this canyon, and I have to be ashamed of my own kitchen. Silas, I can." He was across the room before she finished the sentence. He caught her by the back of her hair and drove her head into the edge of the open cupboard door. The sound was sharp and internal, more felt than heard. The world went briefly white. When it came back, she was on her knees on the floorboards, and he was above her, his voice still at that terrible measured pitch, explaining at length the ways in which she had failed, the specific standards of a man of his standing. She stopped hearing the words. She had long since stopped hearing them. She was focused entirely on not losing consciousness, on keeping her hands under her, on breathing through the pain radiating from her temple and the right side of her face. When he finally left the kitchen, his footsteps moving deliberately down the hall toward his study, Vivian stayed on the floor. The cold came up through the floorboards and into her palms. Outside, the wind had picked up, coming in hard off the range, rattling the kitchen window in its frame. She was still on the floor when, somewhere far away in the white dark of the canyon, she heard the sound. It was high and thin and anguished, a human cry, but coming from outdoors, from the direction of the canyon road. It cut off abruptly. Then, beneath the wind, there was a second sound, the slow, heavy footsteps of something very large moving through deep snow. Vivienne raised her head. The footsteps stopped at the porch. There was a pause, a long one, and in that pause she heard Silas's study door open at the back of the hall. She heard him call out, "Who's there?" The front door opened. The man who stepped into the hall of the Dalt house was not from Harrow Creek. That was the first and most immediate fact about him. Harrow Creek men were lean and weathered in the specific way of valley farmers, worn to the shape of their labor. This man was something else entirely. He stood well over 6 feet, wrapped in a canvas duster covered in snow and dark staining from hard travel. His face was largely obscured by a full beard matted with ice crystals. His hands, bare despite the temperature outside, were the size of stone sledges and the color of old saddle leather. He carried a long rifle slung across his back, a hunting knife on his belt, and the look of a man who had been awake for longer than comfort allowed. His name was Rem Taggart. He had come down from the upper range country east of the Absarokas, where he ran a trap line from September through to first thaw. He came to town once a year, sometimes twice, if the season demanded it. He traded his pelts, resupplied his powder and salt and coffee, and went back up into the high country with the studied relief of a man escaping something. He did not like towns. He did not like the particular smell of civilization, which was, in his experience, the smell of people doing harm to one another at close quarters and calling it community. He had been intending to reach the Harrow Creek trading post before the next storm sealed the pass for good. The canyon road had been hard going, the drifts chest-high in the narrows, and when his saddle horse had broken through a crusted shelf of ice over the creek and come up lame on its right foreleg, he had made the pragmatic calculation that a man died of stubbornness faster than he died of cold. He had left the horse sheltered in a stand of spruce, wrapped in the canvas from his pack, and set out on foot. He had been walking for 2 hours through the canyon when he heard the sound coming from the largest structure on the road, a solid 2-story house with a mill wheel and 2 outbuildings, lights burning in the downstairs windows. He had stood in the snow outside the house for a moment, listening, in the way of a man who has spent years in wilderness, developing a finely calibrated instinct for the difference between ordinary sound and something wrong. What he heard through the walls of the Dalt house was not ordinary. He tried the door. It was unlocked. Silas appeared from the hallway, his face doing the rapid calculation of a man accustomed to controlling the terms of any situation. His eyes went to the size of the intruder, then to the rifle on his back, then back to the face with the ice-matted beard. "This is private property," Silas said. "Whatever you want, the trading post is another quarter-mile up the road. Get out of my house." Rem Taggart had not yet looked at Silas Dalt. He was looking at the woman on the kitchen floor, visible through the doorway, who had not yet risen, whose right hand was pressed against the side of her head. He took in the room with the slow, particular attention of a man who reads landscape for a living. The scattered food on the floor, the open cupboard with the dark mark on its edge. The woman's careful, practiced stillness. He had seen that stillness before. He had seen it in prey animals that had been run a long time. "Who hurt her?" Rem said. It was not a question about jurisdiction. It was not a question about law or trespass or the right of a man to conduct his own household as he saw fit. It was simply a factual inquiry. Silas's face shifted into something harder. "That is my wife, and she is none of your business. I am Silas Dalt. I own this property, I own this mill, and I hold the deeds to more land in this canyon than you'll see in your lifetime. You have about 10 seconds to turn around and walk back out that door before I have you arrested for breaking and entering." Rem looked at him then. "You hit her," Rem said, with a flat certainty that was not an accusation but a statement of simple observed fact, the same tone a man might use to say the weather had turned. "I am warning you." Rem crossed the entry hall in 4 steps. Silas, who had not survived decades of frontier commerce by being slow to read a room, pivoted and went for the rifle hanging above the kitchen doorway. He nearly reached it. Rem caught him by the shoulder and turned him around with a force that was not theatrical but mechanical, the efficient application of considerable mass and leverage. He drove Silas back into the kitchen wall hard enough to knock 2 plates from the open shelf above, and held him there with one hand flat against his sternum, which was all that was required to keep Silas Dalt, a large and physically capable man, completely and absolutely still. Rem studied him at close range for a moment. Then he said quietly, "You're done with that." He released Silas, stepped back, and picked up one of the fallen plates from the floor and set it on the shelf. Then he walked to the kitchen doorway and crouched down beside Vivienne, who had pushed herself up to sitting against the base of the work table and was watching him with the wide, assessing eyes of a person who has learned to be very careful about what they trust. "Can you stand?" Rem said. "Yes," Vivienne said. And then, because years of Silas had trained her to qualify every answer, "I think so. You got a coat. Boots. In the hall. Get them." She got them. She moved slowly, not from hesitation, but because the right side of her head was still roaring and her legs were unreliable. Silas watched from the kitchen, breathing audibly, his face a study in the particular rage of a man who cannot at this moment act on what he is feeling, but who is cataloging everything with intense precision, planning the accounting for later. There was no later. Vivienne pulled on her coat and her boots in the hall, and Rem Taggart opened the front door, and she walked through it into the black frozen canyon night, and the snow came down around them and swallowed the sound of the Dalt house behind her. Rem's camp was 3/4 of a mile back up the canyon road, in the spruce hollow where he had left the horse. The animal was still standing, still wrapped, and lifted its head with some relief when they arrived. Vivian sat on the pack frame, and Rem examined the leg by lantern light and made his assessment. He could not push the horse further tonight. The storm was coming in hard from the north, and the pass was an hour's travel even in good weather. He built a fire in the hollow, deep enough in the trees to be sheltered from the wind, and arranged the canvas into a rough windbreak. He gave Vivienne the heavier of his 2 wool blankets. He brewed coffee in the camp tin and pressed it into her hands without comment. She sat with the tin between her palms and looked at the fire. "Why," she said finally. Rem was feeding small branches into the flames. He didn't look up immediately. "Why what? Why did you stop? Most men." She didn't finish that. She had been about to say most men heard and kept walking, but she stopped because she didn't want to say it plainly, to hear it said in the open air. "I heard you," Rem said simply. "He'll come after us. Probably. He has connections in Lander. A man he pays in the land office. He'll have a warrant made up, probably," Rem said again, not as dismissal but as acknowledgement. He fed another branch to the fire. "Spend your worry on getting warm tonight." They could not go back down the canyon, and the pass north was impassable until the storm broke. So they stayed. 2 days in the spruce hollow, the horse resting its leg, the storm hammering the canyon walls, with a sound like something enormous dragging itself across the world. Rem was not a conversational man by nature, but silence was not uncomfortable for him, and Vivienne was deeply accustomed to silence, so they existed together in the camp without friction, which was more than she had managed inside a house with another person for 4 years. On the second night, the fever came. It came fast and hard, the way fevers do in cold and shock, and by morning Vivienne was delirious, burning inside the wool blankets, her fingers picking at the canvas with a detached industry that meant nothing. Rem broke camp and got her onto the horse, sitting behind her to keep her upright, and rode up through the breaking storm toward his line cabin at the upper timber. 12 miles of bad country and cold that pressed at 30 below. He had made worse trips. He had not made them with another person. The cabin was small, the interior roughly finished, with a stone hearth and a raised wood platform covered in elk hides that served as a bed. Rem got Vivian onto the hides and got the fire going, melting snow for water, brewing the willow bark he carried in his medicinal kit. He had learned field medicine the way he had learned everything else useful in his life, from necessity, trial, and the particular education that comes from being the only person available to deal with a problem. Vivian was sick for 11 days. He did not leave the cabin. He checked his nearest trap line once, early, when her fever had broken overnight, and he was confident she would stay coherent until he returned. Otherwise, he fed the fire, changed the compress on her head, where the skin had split against the cupboard door, spooned broth into her when she was awake enough to swallow, and let her sleep. He was not sentimental about it. She was alive in his cabin, and she required attending to, so he attended to her. What he did not expect, when the fever finally left for good on the 12th day, was for her to prop herself up on her elbows and say, in a voice still raw from the illness, "I need you to teach me how to use that rifle." He looked at her from across the room. "Silas is going to send someone," she said. "I'm not going back with them." Rem studied her for a long moment, then he said, "You fire a long rifle before?" "A shotgun." "Once. Different animal." He thought about it. "You'll need a few weeks before you're strong enough. We'll start when you can walk to the tree line and back without sitting down." She could make the tree line and back inside of a week. She had underestimated herself, or perhaps she had simply never before had occasion to find out what she was capable of when no one was controlling the terms of her movement. The weeks that followed were unlike anything in Vivien's experience, not in the manner of fairy stories or dramatic revelations, but in the quiet, physical, incremental way of a life rebuilding itself from the materials available. She learned to read the sign of animals in the snow. She learned to set a snare and check it before the cold took the morning light. She learned to split wood with a methodology that Rem demonstrated without patronizing her, simply showing her the angle and the weight distribution, and then stepping back to let her figure out the rest. Her hands blistered and then hardened. The particular anxiety that had lived in her chest for 4 years, that constant preemptive bracing against something incoming, began very slowly to quiet. She also learned to shoot the long rifle. It took 2 weeks to be consistent, and another to be something more than consistent. Rem was a patient teacher in the way of a man who holds silence as a natural state and does not waste commentary. He corrected her stance twice. After that, he did not correct it again because it did not require correcting. She had, underneath everything that had been done to her, a steadiness that she had not previously had any use for. They did not speak much about what had happened in the canyon. There was no dramatic accounting of grief, no formal declaration of its end. It was present in the way that old weather is present in a person's bones, factual and occasionally aching, but no longer in charge of the forecast. Below in the valley, Silas Dalt was doing what Vivienne had known he would do. He had spent 2 weeks assembling a legal framework for his grievance. He had sent a rider to Lander with money and instructions, and a warrant had been produced declaring Vivienne a missing person, and Rem Taggart a fugitive accused of assault, abduction, and theft. He hired a man named Calder Voss, a tracker out of Rawlins, who was known in certain circuits for bringing in what he went after. Voss charged $500 and brought his own man, a former railroad detective named Burke, who did not speak much, but who shot very accurately at distance. Silas himself came up from the canyon in May, when the high country opened. He came because he needed to see it concluded personally. He was not the kind of man who could tolerate an unresolved problem. Vivienne's absence was an open wound in his public narrative, a thing the town whispered about, and he had decided that bringing her back and managing the story was worth the discomfort of altitude. The morning Voss's party came up through the timber. Rem was below the cabin at the creek, clearing ice from his waterline with a hand axe. The first shot from Voss's man Burke came without warning, a single crack from the east ridge that kicked up ice 6 inches from Rem's left boot. He dropped behind the creek bank and took stock. 2 men on the ridge, at least, based on the angles. More somewhere below, because Voss was not a man who came with only 2. He was pinned. The creek bank gave him cover in 2 directions, but not the third, and Burke on the ridge had a clean line if he moved east. At the cabin, Vivienne heard the shot. She did not freeze. She had been waiting, in the specific way of a person who has prepared for something, for this particular morning, or one like it. She stood from the chair where she had been mending a strap of harness and crossed the cabin floor and picked up the Winchester from its place beside the door. She checked the load. She looked out the single window toward the tree line to the south. Silas was in the clearing. He was alone, or presenting as alone, which, with Silas, amounted to the same thing. He was wearing his good wool coat and his town hat, and he had a revolver held loosely at his side, a silver-mounted piece he had carried since Vivienne had known him. He looked at the cabin, with expression she had seen 100 times in their kitchen, the expression of a man who has decided how a thing will go and is simply waiting for the world to arrange itself accordingly. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. He looked around the interior of the cabin. The rough log walls, the stone hearth, the elk hides, the small ordered life that had accumulated in the month since December. His lip curled in the specific way she had also seen 100 times. He looked at her. "Vivienne," he said, and his voice was the same measured corporate patience she had spent 4 years trying to satisfy. "This has gone on long enough. Put that down and get your things." She was standing 8 feet from him with the Winchester across her forearms. She had not raised it yet. "There are 2 men on the ridge with rifles," he said. "Rem Taggart is pinned at the creek. I am standing in front of you with a gun. You are going to put that rifle against the wall, and you are going to walk out to the horses with me, and then we are going down to Harrow Creek, and you are going to tell the people there that you were frightened and confused, and that the trapper took advantage of your distress." He said this without heat, the way a man reads terms off a contract. "That is what is going to happen." "No," Vivian said. Something shifted in his face, not quite surprise, more an upgrading of his assessment, a quiet recalibration. He raised the silver revolver and aimed it at her chest. "I will not ask again." Vivian looked at him. She looked at him the way she had not been able to look at him for 4 years, straight and level, without the constant internal adjustment of a person managing their own fear. She saw what Rem had named in the canyon road that first night without fanfare, a man who relied entirely on the agreement of the people around him to be afraid, and she was not afraid. She raised the Winchester, seated it against her shoulder, exhaled, and fired. The shot took Silas in the right shoulder. He went backward into the door frame, the revolver falling, his good wool coat tearing at the seam as he dropped hard to his knees. He was not dead. She had not tried to kill him. She had tried to stop him, and the shoulder was where she had aimed. He looked up at her from the floor, breathing in high, thin gasps, pressing his hand against the wound. For the first time in their shared history, his face held something other than calculation. It held a genuine and complete incomprehension. "You'll hang," he managed. "The law comes up here," Vivian said. "They're welcome to hear the story. Both of us have one to tell." She stepped over him and out the door of the cabin into the pale May morning. Below at the creek, the shooting had stopped. Rem had charged the east slope under fire, making the kind of move that worked because no rational person expected it, and had taken Voss's hired man Burke off his ridge position by main force. Burke, sensibly, had not attempted to continue the engagement. Voss, who was practical in the way of men who survive by reading the odds, had assessed the situation from the tree line and reached his own conclusions. His contract was with Silas Dalt. He had watched through the cabin window. The contract's employer was currently on the floor of a mountain cabin, and the woman who had put him there was standing in the doorway holding a rifle with the specific composure of someone who knew how to use it. Voss collected his remaining man and withdrew back down the timber in the direction of the lower canyon. Rem came up from the creek, bleeding through his shirt on the left side where a piece of rock flung up by a rifle shot had opened a shallow cut along his ribs. He stopped when he saw Vivienne. He looked at the cabin, he looked at the blood on the doorframe. "Silas," she said. "Bad? Shoulder. He'll live if he gets down to a doctor." Rem was quiet for a moment. Then, "He won't press charges, I know." She did know. The charges required a public accounting. A public accounting required Harrow Creek to examine what Silas Dalt had done inside his own house for 4 years, and what the town had done about it, which was nothing. Silas was not a man who could afford that examination. Rem looked at her for a moment. "You did that clean," he said. "Yes," Vivienne said. And then, because she had spent 4 years not being allowed to admit to anything, she said, "I practiced." They did not go back to Harrow Creek. There was nothing to go back to. They spent the summer at the timberline, running Rem's trapline together. And when autumn came, they moved the operation further east, up into a stretch of upper country that Rem had been watching for 2 seasons, but had not yet claimed. They built a second structure there, larger than the line cabin, with a real chimney and a plank floor. 2 years later, a federal land surveyor passing through the high country recorded in his notes a homestead at the upper Absaroka bench, well kept, with a winter kitchen garden under glass frames, a stable with 3 horses and a mule, and 2 residents who declined to give their family names, but who offered him coffee and a dry place to sleep before he continued east. He noted that the woman of the house appeared to be engaged in the skinning of a large elk, and that she was very efficient about it. He did not note, because he had no reason to, that 4 years earlier she had been a ghost in a Wyoming canyon town, moving through her own life as though she had already died in it. He could not have known, looking at the straight-backed, capable woman with the calloused hands and the steady eyes, that she had spent most of a decade trying to disappear. She had not managed it. Some people, it turns out, are harder to erase than the people trying to erase them ever expect.